Good evening, Moffat and Dumfries. This is the first of two short talks on the Star of Bethlehem, where we're thinking about whether or not an astronomical candidate could explain what's in the Bible, in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, and also can it explain what's in the famous Christmas carol. So what we're looking at, excuse me, the Zoom has just cut in again because of a rival. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is the Gospel of St. Matthew, reminding ourselves about the Magi and the star in the east. And then we'll think about what possible astronomical candidates there might be, and asking ourselves how well do they fit the Gospel of St. Matthew, the account. We'll have a look at the timings of what might have been in the sky, what happened when, and do any of the timings of what was around fit the timing of the Nativity. And then we'll use Starry Night to actually have a look at the sky 2,000 years ago to get an idea of what was going on, and then a brief summary. So firstly, let's just remind ourselves about what's in the account of St. Matthew. I'm going to highlight in red the various aspects that we are trying to explain. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. That's the first thing we've got to try and deal with, the appearance of a star in the east. Bear in mind that the Bible doesn't say that they followed the star. It says that they were prompted to go to Jerusalem by the appearance of a star in the east. They saw the star and they headed west. They asked King Herod, what's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews? And Herod was unaware of what they were talking about. So the Magi journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 things shown in red are the 5 elements of the account that we're trying to deal with here. But as well as the account in the Bible, I thought it was worth just taking a quick think about what's actually covered in the famous Christmas carol. So just one more time, let's listen to the lyrics in the first verse of We Three Kings. I won't play it all because I'm sure you all know about this. But when we think about We Three Kings of Orient are, we should remind ourselves, well, actually, the Bible doesn't talk about 3. It doesn't talk about 3 wise men, doesn't talk about 3 magi. There's no mention of how many people came to pay homage to the baby Jesus. It talks about people bringing 3 gifts, gold, frankincense and myrrh, and it's often assumed that if there were 3 gifts, there must have been 3 people. The possibility that there were actually 20 magi and 17 didn't bother to bring gifts, that's not under consideration. It's always assumed to be 3, but the Bible doesn't talk about 3, so we really ought not have that in the Christmas carol. And where did kings come from? Again, there's no mention of kings in the Bible. It talks about magi, the plural of magus, a wise man. The gender in the original language indicates it was male rather than female. But there's no mention of kings, so we really ought not have that in the Christmas carol either. Where did these magi come from? Well, again, there's no geographic location mentioned anywhere in the account of St. Matthew, anywhere in the Bible. So they might have come from Persia, they might have come from India, they might have come from further east in Outer Mongolia, but basically we don't know the origin. And as I said in the first place, we know that they were prompted by a star in the east, but then they went west, so they didn't follow that star. So you can see the Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces, and as a scientist I prefer accuracy and precision, so we really ought to change all of the lyrics of We Three Kings to make it more strictly accurate. So it ought to be something more like, we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are. And we saw a star. And now you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. The original is not very accurate, but at least it meters quite well. And whenever we think of the three wise men, we should remind ourselves there weren't necessarily three wise men. There were n wise men, where n is some number greater than 1 and less than infinity. Greater than 1 because the original word of magi is indeed plural, but we don't know how many. Okay, so Christmas carols aren't a very good guide as to what's going on. But when we think about the Star of Bethlehem, we should remind ourselves that star does not mean a star in the sense that we understand it today. We know that a star is a large ball of gas held together by gravity, and there's thermonuclear reactions going on at the core. But centuries or millennia ago, the word star was simply used to mean something in the night sky, presumably other than the moon. And some of those have been handed down to us. A wandering star, rather than a star that's fixed in place relative to all of the constellations, a wandering star is what we would now call a planet. And a broom star or a hairy star, a star that doesn't appear as a point of light but seems to have an attached tail, those are what we now understand to be comets. And in the case of meteors, that word shooting star, that phrase shooting star, is of course still used in some lay contexts. Some people prefer to talk about shooting stars rather than meteors. So you can see that star can mean almost anything. Basically, we should treat it as something in the night sky. Do we get any clues from any of the paintings of the Adoration of the Magi? Of course, these paintings were made many, many centuries after the Nativity, but it's worth having a look to see if there's any clues. At the top there, we see the Star of Bethlehem apparently shining down its radiance onto the baby Jesus. If we look at Botticelli, 1475, what do we see? Apart from Botticelli himself on the right-hand side, photobombing his own painting. At the back there we see Joseph looking extremely bored and apparently not taking part at all in the celebration. Perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he didn't take any part in the conception either, so maybe that's all fine. Again, we occasionally get indications of what the star is in the background, but given that it's an artistic representation, it doesn't really tell us anything. It was only Giotto that actually showed the Star of Bethlehem apparently as a comet rather than as a stellar type star. That's why the space probe that went to Comet Halley was called Giotto in honour of the painter who presumably did have an inkling that maybe a comet was the Star of Bethlehem. Rubens, I'm not sure of the date of this particular painting. This is one of the few paintings I found of the Adoration of the Magi in which there doesn't appear to be a star in the background. The sky doesn't seem to have a star anywhere there. There does appear to be in the background a two-headed camel, but no stars in the sky. Notice that all of these paintings, of course, there are three kings, because that's the idea that there were three kings, even though that's not what the Bible actually says. We have to remind ourselves about how people attached astrological significance to the sky. Every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation had some sort of astrological significance. For instance, if we think about the planets, Venus or Aphrodite, if you like, the planets being named after gods, Venus or Aphrodite symbolized beauty or fertility or birth. And Jupiter or Zeus was the chief god, if you like. It was the king of planets. It was representing royalty in the sky. Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, as you can perhaps tell from the first three letters of its name, was considered to be the king of stars. And Leo itself, the constellation that's seen by many cultures as outlining something that looks like a lion's mane because of the nature of the sickle, well, the Leo was often associated with the Lion of Judea, because the Judean flag, the flag representing the people of Judea or the land of Judea, had a lion on it, and therefore the lion in the sky became associated with the land of Judea. So why do astrologers have this idea that it's worth looking at the sky and attaching significance to what's in the sky? Well, it was because it was believed that that's where God laid out his plans for mankind. If you want to know whether you're going to have a good crop this year, if you want to know whether there's going to be a famine or a flood or an earthquake, you look at the sky and that's where God tells you what's going to happen. In other words, the sky was effectively God's Facebook page. That's where he would post any news that was of relevance to mankind. And therefore astrologers would look at the sky every night to see what was in store for them. Let's have a think at possible star candidates. Let's consider the candidates and ask ourselves, does it match the idea of a star appearing in the east? Would it have been significant? Is it reasonable to assume that Herod might not have been aware of said star? Could the star reappear, and could the star stop in the sky? If we think about shooting stars, well, they appear all over the sky, so why would you talk about a star in the east? Meteor showers occur all the time, so they're not particularly significant. So that means it's perfectly sensible that Herod wasn't aware of any significance. Meteors can reappear in the sky because one shower can appear and then perhaps weeks or months later another shower could appear in the sky. But why would you ever talk about a meteor shower stopping in the sky? That doesn't make sense. What about the appearance of a comet? Yes, it could appear in the east and could be significant if it's bright enough. But if it was bright, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? Herod didn't have particularly good eyesight, but presumably he employed astrologers to tell him what the sky was telling us. A comet can orbit the sun and it might disappear for a while as it goes behind the sun and then reappear in the sky. So that's definitely a possibility. But how would you interpret a comet stopping in the sky? What about the appearance of a new star? Strictly not a new star, but a star recently visible that was previously invisible. Could such a star appear in the east? Yes, they can appear essentially anywhere. If it was bright enough, it might be considered significant. But again, we have the problem. If it's bright enough to be significant, why wasn't Herod aware of it? Could a star reappear in the sky if the star was a nova? Well, you do get recurrent nova, but generally on much longer timescales than would be necessary to account for the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem. And a nova is one of the fixed stars, regardless of the fact that it's changed brightness. And if it's fixed relative to all the other stars in the sky, why would you talk about the star stopping in the sky? Excuse me a second. And the final category, the next category is the supernova, which is essentially very similar to the nova. It has a different astrophysical origin, but effectively it's a new star that appears very bright. If a supernova goes off relatively close to the solar system, then it could be very bright in the night sky, possibly even visible in the daylight sky. So it could appear in the east. If it's bright enough, it would be significant. Again, if it's bright enough to be significant, why wasn't Herod aware of its existence? And generally speaking, if a supernova occurs because a star blows itself to pieces, they don't tend to do that twice. So once a star has gone supernova, it's unlikely to reappear in the sky. And again, if it's in a fixed position relative to the constellations, why would you say the star stopped in the sky? But if we're talking about a conjunction, planets lining up in the sky, then it's possible to interpret all of those 5 aspects that we're trying to deal with as a conjunction. A conjunction can occur in the east. It can be significant depending on which planet is in conjunction with which planet in which constellation. And perhaps the astrologers of Herod's court didn't attach the same significance to a conjunction of planets, and therefore Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about. Conjunctions can reoccur in the sky, and as we'll see shortly, planets can stop in the sky. So it does seem to tick all the boxes. Let's just remind ourselves about planetary motion. Two hypothetical planets going around the sun. The one closer to the sun moves faster. As well as having a shorter distance to cover, it is moving more slowly, and it takes less time to go around the sun. So planets can appear in different parts of the zodiac, and every once in a while they will line up. Generally speaking, because the orbits of planets are not absolutely in the same plane, when two planets cross in the sky, usually one goes a little north or south of the other, rather than passing in front of each other. The same reason we don't have a solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse each month, because the moon is in a tilted orbit and it tends to pass the sun slightly high or slightly low, rather than actually covering the sun, which it does, of course, every once in a while. And because the inner planets move faster than the outer planets, if we imagine the inner planet here, the green one is Earth, and the outer planet, the red one, could be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, then the planets in the sky, as we watch them, will tend to drift from west to east, as the planets in this diagram go round the sun in an anti-clockwise fashion, as seen from above the North Pole of the Earth. But because every once in a while the Earth will undertake the planet, it will basically pass it on the inside lane because it's going faster, even though the planet is continuing to move in the same direction. It will appear for a short time, for a few months perhaps, it'll appear to move backwards simply because the Earth is moving faster than it and we are overtaking it. So the apparent motion of the planet on the sky is a general drift from west to east, but every once in a while it will stop in the sky, move backwards, stop in the sky again, and then continue moving forwards, continuing its west to east movement. If we just run that again and remind ourselves, this is what all of the outer planets will appear to do against the backdrop of the zodiac constellations. They will move west to east, and then they will stop in the sky, move backwards for a while, stop in the sky again, and then continue moving forwards. So we understand why that motion occurs, so-called retrograde motion. It doesn't matter whether you understand the origin, it was known that these planets did this in the sky. Let's have a look at the timeline to see what we are trying to deal with. One thing to remember about years close to the birth of Christ is that there was no year 0. If you go backwards from 1 AD, you get to 1 BC. There is no 0 AD. That's something to bear in mind if you're using a piece of planetarium software and you're dialing up what was in the sky in 4 BC, for instance. Remember to check whether or not your software correctly does not put a 0 in. I know at least one piece of software that does it incorrectly. So when was Christ born? Well, we don't know, but many people think it's somewhere between 4 and 8 BC. That's judging from the fact that, as far as we know, King Herod died in 4 BC. Now, there's no way to date that precisely because nowhere, chiseled on a piece of stone, is a statement King Herod died in 4 BC. We have to date events usually from other events. So, for instance, King Herod died this many months after the eclipse, which followed the season of the flood, which followed this, which followed that, which followed the other. In other words, you can piece together a series of events to try and date a particular thing that you're dealing with. But some people believe that the eclipse that's been used to date Herod's death, people have chosen the wrong eclipse because of a mistranslation. Remember, the Bible has been translated through a few different languages. And if they have got the wrong eclipse, then maybe instead of dying in 4 BC, he died in 1 BC. In which case it's possible that Christ was born a few years later, perhaps between 1 and 3 BC. So you can see there's quite a large error bar in exactly when we should be thinking about the birth of Christ. But what do we know happened in terms of things in the sky that could possibly have been the Star of Bethlehem? Well, we know there were a few comets around. There was a bright comet around in 12 BC. We know that because that's Halley's Comet. We've seen it come round a few times since then, of course. And generally speaking, it's a relatively large nucleus. There's a lot of ice there. It will generate a big tail as it comes and sweeps into the inner solar system. So it's quite possible that Halley was a very bright, possibly spectacular comet, but would that have been the Star of Bethlehem if it appeared in 12 BC? Isn't that a bit early for God to be posting onto his Facebook page about the birth of the King of the Jews? Okay, there were two other comets in 5 and 4 BC. The comet in 5 BC was Comet Holmes, the one that came round not that long ago and had a coma that expanded enormously and ended up huge, about the size of the sun, as it passed not too far away from the Earth. But it's very unlikely that that comet was very bright in its 5 BC apparition. The comet in 4 BC was the comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, the comet that Rosetta visited and then landed a little Philae lander on, otherwise known as Comet 67P. So again, we know about that comet, but it's relatively small. It would not have developed a spectacular tail. So although the timing is about right, it doesn't seem it's bright enough. So as far as comets are concerned, they were bright but at the wrong time, or they were at the right time but weren't bright enough. The Chinese saw a nova in 5 BC, and apparently the Koreans saw a nova in 4 BC. Now, nova don't tend to come along that often, at least not bright nova that can be easily seen with the naked eye, which of course they must have been to be seen at this stage before the invention of the telescope. Now, it's unlikely that two came along in quick succession at the end of 5 BC or the beginning of 4 BC. It's much more likely that there's been some sort of mistake in the way the calendars have been calculated, and I think they probably saw the same nova at the end of one year or the beginning of the next year. But as we've said, nova doesn't seem to fit the bill simply because why would you talk about a star stopping in the sky if the star is a fixed star? So it meets some of the criteria, but not all of the criteria. But conjunctions of planets are very interesting. Here I'm using the symbol for conjunction, the astrological symbol, and for brevity I'm using the symbols for Jupiter here, the curly 4, and Saturn, the curly H, and Venus over here on the right hand side, reminding you on the left here of the symbols. So there was a set of conjunctions in 6 BC between Jupiter and Saturn, much like the ones we saw a few years ago when again Jupiter and Saturn came close in the sky and passed within a distance of a fraction of the, just about the size of the full moon, that sort of distance. But although some people interpret that conjunction as being the Star of Bethlehem, I think the one that occurs a few years later is actually much more interesting. This is a conjunction not between Jupiter and Saturn, but between Jupiter and Venus. Remember, Venus is the brightest the brightest planet in the sky. Jupiter is a close second. Saturn is a lot fainter by comparison. So a conjunction of bright Jupiter with bright Venus would have been in itself more spectacular than a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. But it's worth looking in more detail at what was going on between 3 and 2 BC. So let's use Starry Night to get an idea. I'm looking in the direction of Leo, and I'm not labelling everything in the picture. I've got the constellations labelled so you can see Gemini, Cancer, Leo, etc. And the star Regulus there, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. And the planets are moving backwards and forwards in the zodiac, which is running roughly where I'm indicating now, top right to bottom left. I've labelled Jupiter, but I'm not going to label all the other planets because the labels just get very confusing as soon as you run this time lapse forward to see what happens. I'm going to stare in the direction of Leo, despite the fact that I'm going to run through many months. And so a lot of planets are going to flash by, and I'm not going to show the horizon, otherwise the horizon will be leaping backwards and forwards all the time and you will start to get nauseous after a while. So I'm not putting the horizon in, I'm just pointing in the direction of Leo to see what the planets are doing. This particular simulation has started in August of 3 BC. And I'm now going to run forward to see what happens. So remember, the inner planets move faster than the outer planets, and this is the planet Venus moving from west to east, so it's going to be catching up to Jupiter, which is also moving west to east. So let's see what happens in the next few weeks. Okay, we're now in the middle of August 3 BC, and Venus is in conjunction with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. So how might that be interpreted by an astrologer? Well, let's think of the significance of each of the elements of Venus in conjunction with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, the land of Judea, the Jews. So Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in Leo could be interpreted as birth, king, Jew. A birth of the king of the Jews. Where did this particular star appear? When Venus, the very bright Venus and very bright Jupiter, when they were in conjunction, where would they be in the sky? They would be visible not that far from the sun in the early morning before sunrise. They would be a star in the east. So we have a star in the east signifying birth of the King of the Jews. This might have got the astrologers quite interested. So they would watch the sky for the next few months to see what happened next. Venus would continue moving towards the east, and Jupiter, you notice, now passes close to Regulus. The king of planets is in conjunction with the king of stars. As Jupiter continues to move, the Earth overtakes it, which means Jupiter apparently stops in the sky. We're now in November, December of 3 BC. Jupiter stops in the sky because of the Earth's motion and appears to be moving backwards in the sky. And as Jupiter moves backwards in the sky, it passes Regulus for a second time. The king of planets passes the king of stars twice. As Jupiter comes to a stop a second time, because the Earth is now moving away and Jupiter resumes its west to east motion, Jupiter passes Regulus for a third time. So the king of planets and the king of stars are doing a little bit of a dance, and there's a triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. It's as if one king is passing power over to a new king. Perhaps they ought to go and talk to King Herod, the king in Jerusalem, and ask him, what's this we see in the sky about a birth of a new king and one king handing over to a new king? But at what point is it worth going to talk to Herod? Well, they continue watching the sky to see what happens next. Venus has been round the sun and is back again. Remember, Venus doesn't take anything like as long as Jupiter to go around the sun, so Venus is back again. What happens in the next few weeks? Venus comes back into conjunction with Jupiter. Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction a second time. The star reappears in the sky. How close is this conjunction? Well, the previous one would have been similar to the one we saw between Saturn and Jupiter a few years back. They would have been close in the sky, close to be interesting, close enough to be interesting, but for instance, a fraction of the diameter of the full moon. This conjunction in June of 2 BC is much, much, much closer. No person would have been able to resolve Jupiter and Venus as two separate points. They would have been so close, they would have merged as one point of light in the sky. The very bright Venus and the very bright Jupiter would have merged into a single blob of light. Let me show you just how close they got. Remember, we didn't have telescopes back in these days, but just to give the impression of how close, let me imagine we had a telescope and we could zoom in to see how close they got. You see how close the disk of Jupiter was to the disk of Venus. This particular software shows Venus as its surface rather than as the very bright cloud layer. So remember, Venus would be dazzlingly bright, but the disk of Jupiter and Venus would be close enough such that from some parts of the Earth they would actually touch, and part of one planet would occult the other. And we're talking here about a field of view of only, well, less than an arc minute or so. So nobody would be able to resolve these as two separate objects. How often would you expect a conjunction of planets as close as this? Between Jupiter and Venus, how often would you get a conjunction this close? Well, I'm not sure of the actual number, but I'd be surprised if it happens more times than a few times every millennium. So it's almost a given that the astrologers would not have seen anything like this in their lifetimes. So let me just summarize what it is we've just been looking at. In 3 BC, there's a conjunction, not a particularly spectacular one, but a close conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo, which could have been interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews. Over the next few months, the King of Planets passes the King of Stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times, indicating that one king is passing power over to another king. And then, as they continue watching, they see an incredibly close conjunction of the same Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo, something they would have never have seen before, and perhaps this was the starting pistol that made them think, we ought to go and have a word with King Herod and find out what's going on. How long would it have taken them to get to Bethlehem? Well, of course, we have no way of telling because we don't know where they came from. Some people think they came from Persia, perhaps they were more distant from India, perhaps even from further east than that. Further east. But we don't know if they were travelling on foot. If you believe the Christmas cards, they were always on camels, but we don't actually know if that was the case or not. So it might have taken them many months before they got to Bethlehem. It's interesting to note that in December of that same year, Jupiter stops in the sky one more time. And on what date does Jupiter stop in the sky? It stops in the sky on December the 25th. Yes, I know that's just a coincidence because the Christians took over the pagan festival celebrating the passing of the longest night. But it's interesting to note that I wonder if the Magi did arrive in December at the time that Jupiter stopped in the sky. So it looks like there's a conjunction or a set of conjunctions that seems to tick all the boxes in the account of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it was these conjunctions that inspired the story that's in the Gospel there. Maybe these conjunctions were seen by a number of people throughout the world, perhaps. They might have been seen by a lot of people, and the story of these conjunctions was passed down from one generation to the next until more than a century later, when the story of these conjunctions was woven into the narrative of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a different astronomical event, or maybe it was a combination of astronomical events that occurred within a few months. It's easy to work out the astronomical facts. We can dial back the clock 2,000 years without any problem to work out where Venus was in the sky, where Jupiter was in the sky, at what time they came into conjunction. Determining the facts is easy. Second-guessing the astrological significance, the significance that the Magi or King Herod's astrologers would have attributed to these events, that's different. That, of course, is pure speculation. But regardless, the underlying message is, of course, the same. May I wish you all a very Merry Christmas. Thank you for listening.